1961, he published the basic principles of how CT could work, and he even filed a patent in 1963 on a radiant energy apparatus for investigating selected areas of interior objects obscured by dense material. So who would like to explain what the problem was at the time? Any guess from the paper? No. Okay, then I will tell you. William Oldendorff was working as a neurologist. He was quite a bright person, so he did his A-level equivalence at the age of 15, then directly entered medical school and became a resident at the age of 22, so he was quite quick. Nevertheless, he was said to be a very humble person, but with a strong incline towards any kind of experimental procedure. So he was not only seeing patients, actually. What the problem was at the time is if you had X-ray around. This was around already for a long time, and there was also ultrasound. The problem was how to look inside the head, because the head is just covered by the skull bone. So whenever you take an X-ray, a lot of that signal is just deleted by the bone, if you like. It's absorbed by the bone. So whatever is in the middle, you can't see it. Is a soft tissue, the brain is soft tissue. There may be some very light local differences in that density, radio density, but if you take a normal X-ray, actually you don't see nothing inside. The skull appears hollow. There have been people experimenting with ultrasound technologies, and who has an idea what the problem with ultrasound is when you want to go into and have a look into the skull? No idea from physics? You get reflection. So there's a lot of reflection at the bone when it comes to ultrasound. What you could do is you could take an ultrasound beam and direct it through the entire volume, and depending on what is inside, you get a change of the signal. It's similar to what the CT works, but that technology was not invented at the time. So ultrasound, even though it can give you very nice pictures from almost every part of the body, it does not work with the lungs, for instance, because of the air, and also for the skull, actually. William Oldendorff was not the only one who described the theoretical principle of computer tomography, but Alan McLeod Cormack at Tufts University in Boston did it round about at the same time, actually. Nevertheless, he just did it in theory. He demonstrated efficacy in practice. So that is the setup William Oldendorff originally proposed. Who would like to explain a little bit what you can see here? Did you have much time to read the papers? No. Not too much? I can also switch over to a seminar mode, guiding you through. Would that be appreciated?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So, what he tried to do is to develop a model of the skull and the brain within. And he did it, by the way, in this garage, in a very, very simple yet fancy setup. So what he created was a plastic box. This is the plastic box seen from top. And there were boreholes in it, so he could put iron nails at rather regular distances in that box, actually. This represents the skull bone. And then he put two other boreholes in where he put an iron nail and an aluminium nail. Aluminium is not as radio dense as iron is, so it would not absorb too much of the X-ray beam. So if you then take a measurement of that structure here, you again don't see much because everything is obscured by the outer nails, actually. They just absorb too much of the radiation. And then he came up with an idea which is so simple and fascinating that I had to call my father, who's an engineer, to tell him what that guy did. So he mounted that entire setup on a toy train track and the flat car. And the toy train track and the flat car was placed on a rotational record player. Quite familiar stuff at the time. And then he had a little setup. He took a motor from an alarm clock, which pulled that flatbed car here with about 80 millimeters per hour, just in front of the beam. This is the X-ray beam here. And since it all was also mounted on the record player, it could rotate with 16 rounds per minute. So he had a combination of both. What you create then is that you can of course record the signal on the other side. And if you do it continuously, you do not only change the angle at which you look at the entire construct, you also, since the flat cat bar is pulled, you also change actually the center where the beam goes into. And those little structures in the middle give you a very tiny difference to what is seen from the outside, depending on the angle and on the position of the flat car. That was basically his idea. So this is the signal he gets with no outer nails, so the skull is removed and no rotation. It's just pulled in front of the X-ray beam. What came first into focus was the iron nail, and you can see a sharp extinction of the signal here. And then next the aluminium nail. It is not as radio dense, so the absorption is not as high. This is what you see here. Then you put all nails on it, and again pull the flat car from one end to the other with no rotation. And what you see is just a random signal actually. Most of that extinction here comes from those outer nails, and so you have no chance to discriminate the inner structure. What he then did was putting all nails in place and started the rotation. It is not as clear as without the outer structure, concealing what is inside, but he could still nicely discriminate the iron nail and the aluminium nail. So now he invented a principle to look with X-ray into something which was not possible before. What he also did, he did the same setup but removed the inner nails. And what you can see here is that there is no signal at all actually, with those inner nails not being in place. So with that very simple experiment, again doing this in your garage with an X-ray source is rather bad, but he did it nevertheless, and he could clearly show that he is able, and he had proposed an apparatus to look inside the skull. He even went further. He put a lead collar around the entire structure. Here you can see the flatbed car. This is the alarm clock motor pulling it along, and this is the turntable beneath, actually. With that lead collar, he added an additional element of concealment. So with no rotation, you could see there's a very sharp drop of the signal because of the lead here. These little spikes here come from the fact that the collar was not entirely closed. So there were brief moments where more of the radiation could go through, actually. When he did turn on the rotation, actually, he could again clearly discriminate the iron nail and the aluminium nail inside. So even so, he added an additional level of concealment to his setup. And yeah, the paper was relatively well received. Not too much interest at the time. What he did, and this is rather a tragic story, after he filed his patent, he went to one of the largest supplier of X-ray technology at the time. I think it was General Electric. I'm not sure. And he displayed that principle and his invention to these people, and the CEO said, even if an apparatus as complex as you suggested would be built, there would never be much use in the huge market for it. So you can be terribly wrong, right? Because nowadays you have a CT in every hospital. So he was so discouraged from that that he completely stopped working on that at all. There was another guy, however, from Nottingham in the UK. In the Second World War, Godfrey Hounsfield worked as a radar technician, actually, for the Air Defense Network. And he came about that paper, and he built the first CT scanner at the company he was working at the time. So do you know the names Hounsfield in another context? Related to CT? No, I will tell you later. So this was the first prototype of a CT scanner. It's much larger than the device Oldendorf created, but you can see it's the basic setup. This would be the track here, that would be the flatbed, and this is the radio source which can now rotate. It's not the object that rotates, but the radio source and the collector rotates. Now it's done nowadays. And this is one of those very, very early scanners coming up in the mid to late 70s. And this is actually the first computed tomography scan. You can see the resolution is relatively poor in that device, but you can clearly see that tumor here. So of course, that led to a Nobel Prize, but Oldendorf did not receive the Nobel Prize. The Nobel Prize went to Hounsfield and Alan Cormack. And there was huge debate at the time why Oldendorf never received the Nobel Prize. And even Hounsfield said that this array, this machine he constructed, was only partially based on the theoretical calculations Cormack did, but was more inspired by the practical work Oldendorf did. Even so, he announced that the Nobel Prize Committee did not award the Nobel Prize to Oldendorf. Rumor has it, they say that the committee at the time was more inclined to give it to basic scientists. So as a radar technician, he's a basic scientist. McCormack was a mathematician, both holding a PhD, but Oldendorf was an MD, more related to a practical application of things, which was not considered Nobel-worthy, if you like. So he received tons of other prizes, but never received the Nobel Prize, which is kind of a shame actually. They could go well together as a crew. This is how it's working today. So this is the very early prototype where you had just one source and one single detector, and that entire setup was rotating around the patient, and then the level was shifted a little bit. Remember the movement of the flat car, and so it took forever to take a scan with that setup. But just a year later, they came up with the idea of multiple sources, still one detector, and shifting it forward and rotating the object. About 5 years later, a single source was invented, but a circular array of detectors, and again, not the object was rotated, but now the entire setup was rotated. And this basically is how we do it nowadays, where you can have a single source or a couple of sources and actually a ring of detectors and very fast rotation of the source actually. So the object is not required to rotate anymore. This is why people can now lie on a table. Those modern scanners are really capable. There can be up to 512 detector arrays, so one after the other, so-called rows. So you not only do one slice, but 512 at a time. An experimental scanner already go up to 1024 of those. And then there's also another use of the name Hounsfield. So here I give name to the so-called Hounsfield unit, which describes how radio-dense a material is. Water is about 0 Hounsfield units, and bone is about 1000 Hounsfield units. Some material can go up to 3,000, but this is only metals. Has no implication in medical use. The scale we usually apply goes from -1,000, which is the Hounsfield units for air, to about 1,000 or slightly higher for some applications. And what you can do then to increase a little bit the contrast of your image, you can define, using the scanner, so-called Hounsfield windows. So the window has a certain level, which means it's the center of the window at a certain Hounsfield value, and then it has a window width, meaning the spread, what you look at. And in carefully choosing your window, you can have optimal contrast for particular structures you want to visualize. So for instance, this is the so-called bone window, and you can really nicely appreciate details from the bone, where all the soft tissue is not so discriminable in that particular scan mode. So the center of the window is about 500 Hounsfield unit, and the width is 2,000 Hounsfield units long. Then you can also have a look at the lungs, which you can see here with a completely different setup, because the center is round about at -600, and then all the soft tissue in the bone give you a very strong extinction, but you can have very nice details from the lung tissue here. So it's the same scan, but a different window actually. If you are interested in soft tissue like muscles, you can get a lot of nice details from soft tissue window, and you may also look at a mediastinal window, which is relatively similar to that, but gives you more details from the mediastinum. So this is how it basically works nowadays. In the brain, there's also a certain brain window, which is quite narrow actually. You can start and discriminate individual structures in the brain. If you would look at the skull with the bone window, you get nice details of the bone, as you can appreciate, but no details at all when it comes to brain structure. So this is how it is usually applied. So clinical scanners, as I said, are in widespread use. Basically in every hospital you have them, and the resolution you can achieve with those is in the range of about 0.5 millimeters, which is already quite detailed. You also have the option for ultra high resolution in micro CT, where you can have a resolution of around about 150 microns. This requires a certain amount of additional radiation. So this is nothing you would do to humans, but you can do, it's not illegal, to experimental animals. And here you can see a mouse brain, or say that, or the vasculature within the mouse brain, then detailed kidney structures, and a tumor in the mouse at a very, very high resolution. You can go even further, but then would require radiation which goes beyond what a mammal can survive, but you can get at the resolutions up to 100, down to 170 nanometers. So you can appreciate the very detailed imaging of that. I think it's a mosquito head, something like this. This is really quite detailed. And here at Warwick we have such a scanner down at the Warwick Manufacturing Group, where they can really look inside structures for proofing material and seeing very tiny cracks in solid iron structures. And they even had a look inside of dinosaur bones, for instance. This is, then you can do that with very, very great detail. What you can also do, you could further enhance the information you get, not only by three-dimensional reconstruction, but also by using contrast agents. Usually, because of its high radio density, it's iodine-based. And here you can see all the blood vessels. Then, if you come at a certain extinction of the signal due to the structure you are imaging in, based on the Hounsfield unit, you can give it a pseudo color, so it all looks quite natural, like you would do in an anatomical dissection. So, do you see something wrong here on these pictures? Just have a guess, it's fine. you see the kidneys here. These are the kidneys. Anything coming to your attention?
No bladder.
There is no bladder, that is true, at least it's not depicted, because there is no iodine in the bladder. If you would wait for a couple of minutes, then you would start seeing the iodine within the bladder. But the iodine-based contrast agent has just been injected intravenously in this proband here. No? There is no, yeah?
On that black image,
Yeah.
there's no blood going to the kidney, or there's no...
Yeah, this is true. This is just the bony structures and the soft tissue. This is just the vessels, and this is it combined. I should have said that. You're right. So that patient, actually, the aorta stops here. There is no aorta going below. There are a lot of collateralization or vessels providing collateralization, so the limbs are supplied, but this is a major anatomical defect. Nevertheless, the patient was completely symptom-free, so with only half of an aorta in place. This is a very nice case study coming from South Korea here. Could you think about that, what that is?
Is that feces and large intestine?
It is large intestines, but not feces. This is a drug carrier. This was not shot in a hospital, but at an airport. So he was eating all these little containers containing the drugs, so they are now in the large intestine. And yeah, maybe a day later, they would come to surface again. Yeah, so these scanners are also used to discover these kinds of drug smuggling, actually. Yeah, so what you can do with these reconstructions, you can have a very detailed appreciation of the vessels supplying the brain. As you can see here, this is an aneurysm. If you have something like this, it should be operated, because if it ruptures, it will result in a major brain bleeding. And as you can go to quite a certain amount of detail with those clinical scanners, you can also have a detailed assessment of these vessels supplying the brain. This is a normal configuration of the circle of Willis and the anterior cerebral arteries. This is a very normal anatomical variant where the two anterior cerebral arteries merge into a single one, the so-called azygos artery. And you have also, which is rather rare, however, cases where people have three anterior cerebral arteries. So, for instance, I'm a person of that kind, actually, that was discovered by chance, and the frequency of that is around about 10 to 15% in the normal population. But this situation is very rare. So you can have really a very detailed assessment here. It is also good for diagnosis, especially when it comes to ischemic stroke, because if you use the contrast agent, you can indirectly measure cerebral blood flow, CBF, cerebral blood volume, and MTT. This means mean transit time, the time it takes for the labeled blood to travel through a certain volume. These are mock scans. You will see that they look identical, but they shall depict different situations. So how would you, have a little guess, interpret the situation in that area here? Those three scans, considered they come from the same patients. So what would we see here? Just have a guess.
Sorry, again, please.
This is cerebral blood flow. Measure cerebral blood flow. You have labeled the blood with iodine. So where you get a strong signal, there is a lot of iodine. What does that image tell you? On a very basic setup. It tells you that there is a so-called perfusion deficit. So here there is not much blood going. Yeah?
Could it be necrosis of the blood?
Sorry?
Could it be the necrosis of the bone tissue over there?
It could be necrosis. In that case, it should mimic a stroke, as these are teaching cases. So there was an occlusion of an artery, so no blood is going there. You also have a very low amount of blood volume being there. And the mean transient time, the time it takes to that little iodine that goes in to travel through that volume, is also very high. And then you have the patient below, where you also have a perfusion deficit. You have a high transit time, but you have a high cerebral blood volume, meaning even though it goes slowly, blood is brought there. Relatively slowly, but it's brought there. So this is a situation when you would reopen the blood vessel here, you could salvage that area. Because from collaterals there is still blood going in here, even though that works very slowly. But it only lasts for a couple of hours, then the tissue would be dead again. And here, there's nothing you can do. This is basically, even if you, if you reopen in time, you may restore the blood flow there, but since there is not a residual blood volume going through, it would be futile. So most of the tissue would be dead already. This was again for illustration. So if you do that in a patient, it's less clear. Here you got a huge cerebral blood flow deficit. You got a certain amount of remaining cerebral blood volume, but it's much less as compared to the other side. And that huge mean transient time here, probably there's not so much tissue you can salvage, even though the native CT does not tell you much of a difference here. This is from an old lady who did not survive that major stroke. That gentleman, slightly younger, he had a smaller area where the cerebral blood flow is lower, but he still had some residual cerebral blood volume going there as compared to a corresponding area on the other side. And even so, the mean transient time was high, and you can see it also in the other areas here. This part is relatively well supplied, and that would become the infarct core. So if you now treat that particular patient, that part in the cycle here would be lost, but the other tissue could be salvaged. But as you can appreciate, it's less clear. You need a certain amount of training to interpret these images properly. Okay, summing it up, the availability of a CT is very good, and you also get very quickly, you get your data. The resolution is good, but not superior. Soft tissue contrast can be poor, even if applying the right Hounsfield windows. Bone contrast is good. You cannot do much functional imaging, but it's really well suitable for clinical use and to some extent also for experimental use. The good thing, it's relatively cheap, so you can have it at many sites actually. Nevertheless, it comes with radiation, and if you do CT scans too often, they can also have other consequences. Now I want to move to the other part of the spectrum, which is positron emission tomography, which is a very expensive, slow technique, not very useful for acute diagnostics, but can give you a lot of interesting information. And this was invented basically by a guy called David Kuhl. He was a radiologist, but his undergraduate studies were in physics. And when already being at high school, he was experimenting with radioactive substances and won several prizes. So he was very, very much interested in the physical side of things. And he worked together with Roy Edwards, who was a technical assistant at that center, and they did a number of really groundbreaking studies, reinventing but very much refining that tomography principle. Oldendorf came up a couple of years before. So they constructed a relatively complex device where you could have those arms here with the source and the collector for the radioactive signal, and all of those were mobile, they could rotate. Also the base on which that arm was sitting could rotate as the entire device could move back and forwards on tracks in the ground. And they invented different modes. So one was what they called the rotary or cylindrical mode, where just the setup being locked in its position was rotated around the subject. They also had something they called the transverse mode, whereby predefined shifting of both components, they could scan through the array. And in the longitudinal mode, actually, they moved the entire device so they could have different sections of the patient's body being investigated. And this was of very much value because at the time, and this was invented, these imaging techniques were really, really poor, and often you couldn't get much information out of that. Could you guess what that organ is? Without looking into the paper? Just by its shape?
Pancreas.
No, but close, very close.
Liver.
Liver, it's the liver actually. This is the liver from a patient which has rather unspecific symptoms, a long history of alcoholism, and they did a standard scan at the time, a rectilinear scan. So and they used a tracer, a substance emitting radioactivity which is specific or gets collected by the liver tissue. If you look at that scan, you don't see much. It's pretty much the normal shape of the entire thing. What Kuhl and Edwards did then, they took the same patient, the same tracer, but now performed a rotary scan. And you can see these different degrees here. It was not a continuous one, they just shifted the angle they were looking at in a systematic way and then put it all together. And then they see that area where there's not much of the agent going, which is actually a malign liver tumor or metastasis. That could also be the case. So they could add significant diagnostic value by performing their rotation technique. Then they had another patient which came to their medical center which had a seizure, and the seizure was preceded by an unwilling movement of the thumb, of the right thumb as far as I can remember. And then they had again these standard scans which they were doing at the hospital at the time, from the left side, from the right side, and from the front. So here a tracer was injected into the blood, and what you can see, for instance, this is the venous mode here. The venous blood is connected here, so we have a strong signal, but it's looking rather homogeneous. The right side, they were not as lucky with catching it at the right time point, but with the frontal scan, they were. Could you guess where's something of an anomaly in those scans? It's really not much. But if you look closer, this looks a little bit suspicious here, because we are looking at the left side, that could be the motor cortex, and there could be a tumor triggering epilepsy, and since the left motor cortex controls the right side, that may explain this unwilling movement of the thumb preceding the seizure. But since this is all obscured by the venous structures collecting the blood, there's not much information you can take out of that. So the symptoms of the patient continued, even though he was put on anti-epileptic drugs. But a couple of months later, he came back in and they did a longitudinal section scan. So all these different sections here, and then at the same time moving the patient's head. And then you could basically scan through the particular volume, and even so you have still all these venous structures, and you can appreciate how poor the qualities of these figures had been at the time. you could still come up with that. There is no continuous venous structure, but you could see a massive enlargement here. This is why the tumor draws a lot of blood, so you get a lot of signal there. And if you reconstruct it, you can see that the tumor is round about situated here, what they predicted, and they were perfectly right. The surgery was performed and they found a glioblastoma here, which nowadays still cannot be treated, so the patient died a couple of months later. But you can see the progress here, right? With a very simple reinvention and refinement of this tomography principle. Other people put it further. So Michael Flaps was the first to build the functional PET scanner, which could be used in numerous modalities. This is the prototype he used. Nowadays it looks, of course, a little bit differently. So far, it has all been the case of gentlemen, but I also need to stress that women had a big impact on that. So Johannes Fowler was a radiochemist who developed new tracer substances which can be applied, which have a certain specificity. For instance, 2-fluor-deoxyglucose. I will introduce you to the principle a little later. And nowadays we use 18-fluor because it gives a better contrast, fluor-deoxyglucose, and that was also first synthesized by Dr. Fowler. And then we had, last year we had a conference here on image-guided neurointervention at Warwick Castle, where we had that guy, a Palestinian guy who went to the US a long time ago, and he was really the first doing a lot of these scans on humans at the University of Pennsylvania. So he really brought forward the PET technology over decades, because it's expensive and it's slow, but it can give you some valuable additional information. Yeah, this is again the machine. You can see in the paper, this is Dr. Kuhl here at the demonstration. This is the phantom, this is the huge arm here, the table on which the patient rests. And what Kuhl and Edwards also did, they did significant work in digitalization. So just 2 years after they came up with that particular device, they used the advent of computer technology to reconstruct those images, because before you had to do it all by hand and calculating from signal extinction, which is a gruesome and laborious process. But with the computers in place, they could be done much, much quicker. And they were also working on combination techniques, in that case CT and technetium imaging, but this is not exactly the same as positron emission tomography, but these combined scanners are still around today, where you, for instance, combine a CT and a PET scanner to get both information, anatomical and functional information, and they use that to refine tumor diagnosis. This is how modern positron emission tomography works. So what you basically use are radionucleotides which emit positrons, antimatter, really fancy stuff. And if those positrons, the so-called beta plus radiation, collides with an electron in the matter surrounding it, and you create 2 photons which are of very high energy, and they just leave the spot in opposite direction. And then you can have a ring of detectors around the part of the body you are investigating, and based on where you detect the signal, you can calculate the location where it comes from. And the fancy idea is here that different tracers can be used to visualize different things. The problem with that is that most of these tracers have very short half-life times. So for instance, you can produce a certain variant of the water molecule where you use 15 oxygen, which emits positrons, but the half-life time of that is just 5 minutes. So it decays very quickly. So this is nothing you can buy, and store it and use it as you need. So you have to continuously create that stuff. This is why most of these positron facilities are covered to a department of radiochemistry. Now they have these huge machines here called hot cells, where a specialist team of radiochemists is able to synthesize these substances. And since the half-life time of the substances and those isotopes is very short, you also have a cyclotron in place, which is basically a kind of reactor with which you can create these very exotic isotypes, which cannot be found in nature, at least not in large amounts, and if they appear, they decay very, very quickly. So this is of course a huge infrastructure, and as you can appreciate, this explains why that technology is so expensive. So have a look at the time. Yeah, we've still got a little time. And this is the fluor-desoxyglucose principle. So what you can do with that, you can measure basically where glucose is metabolized. So you have that molecule which is entering, for instance, with the glucose transporter 1, which would be specific for the brain, could enter any kind of brain cells. Yeah? And with the glucose 6 phosphatase, you can create 18-fluor-desoxyglucose 6-phosphate, and with the normal glucose, it's just glucose 6-phosphate. Whereas the glucose 6-phosphate can enter the TCA cycle and is being metabolized, the 18-fluor-desoxy 6-phosphate cannot, because of the additional fluor you have on the molecule, the isotope. The half-life of that is about 2 hours, so it lasts a little longer. So it's trapped within those cells then and gives a signal. And so you can appreciate where in the brain glucose is metabolized. Primarily in the cortex, of course, but there's also some baseline utilization in the white matter. This is an entirely normal brain with a normal amount of glucose being utilized all over the place, and again, much less in the white matter areas. This is how it works. You can create a lot of tracers for very, very specific things. And you can use it for diagnosis. For instance, if you have a patient being suspected to suffer from Alzheimer's disease, which is the first instance a clinical diagnosis, just from the memory deficits, you really want to make sure. So you can look at glucose metabolism, and what you can see that here are areas where less glucose is metabolized, where it should be metabolized. And this is something you can't know because we never told you. And this is a typical pattern on early stage Alzheimer's disease, because it does not appear homogeneously throughout the brain. It starts in certain areas, so this is quite pathognomonic. Then you may know that these protein deposits like amyloid beta and tau can appear in the normal brain, but only to a small amount. But in Alzheimer's patients, this is a problem, and using tracers against those, you can see how the brain flares up here. So we have much, much more of those proteins being deposited in the brain than would be normal. There are also tracers which allow you to show neuroinflammation, as you can see here, increased inflammation, or synaptic density, reduced synaptic density. So with that you could be sure that this is a typical Alzheimer's brain. And this comes with a dilemma I would like to discuss with you in the last minutes. In my previous role, I was working with people from the Department of Nuclear Medicine at the University of Leipzig. So we had a sheep stroke model and did some PET stuff with that stroke model, but they did much more, of course. And they were developing together with a company a tracer called 18-fluor-beta-B, which is very specific for binding to amyloid beta. So they had, at that time, they were really ahead of the technology curve with that, and were thinking about this as becoming something which could be commercially exploited. And it worked quite well. So what they could show that in probings with Alzheimer's, the tracer binds to the beta amyloid and gives a strong signal. Since there is always a little bit of that protein in a healthy brain as well, they could get a much weaker signal, but still detectable signal in healthy persons. So as a proof of concept, that worked relatively well at the time. The problem they had, because they were following these patients longitudinally, that they saw some people which were based on the cognitive tests assigned to the healthy group, but nevertheless looked like that. What could you think is the dilemma emerging from it? So we just invited those people and said we were wanting to test a new tracer. So there is an Alzheimer's group, you're on the healthy group, and yeah, then you see something like this in a particular probe. What's the dilemma here?
Whether Alzheimer's is behavioral or like physiological.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You may know that these plaques form before the symptoms emerge. That goes on for decades. So what they were basically seeing were patients who were still normal when it comes to cognitive function, but were at very high risk of developing Alzheimer's within a short period of time, because they already were at that heavy plaque load.
Whether you should give like treatment to them preemptively.
There is no treatment. This exactly is the dilemma. So what do you do? Do you tell the patient or don't you tell the patient? What do you think? Yeah, why?
Because if someone knows that they're going to develop Alzheimer's and have a limited amount of time left, then they might alter their life decisions.
Exactly. Get their things in order, enjoy life as long as they can. There's another problem. In some individuals, you can see a high plaque load, but they never develop Alzheimer's. It's not completely understood why. In some individuals, you can see that. So you cannot be, they have a very high risk of developing Alzheimer's, but you are not entirely sure. And what I say now is a sad fact, but it makes the dilemma perfect. Many of those people do not consider the chance you would see, I would personally also see, but they become suicidal from the perspective of suffering from Alzheimer's. But they could be one of the few who never get it. So there's also a value in not telling the patient. And the consequence is people avoided that. I am not as expert at affects, neither were my colleagues, so they decided not to tell the patient and just see what happens. And even so, around about 85–90% developed Alzheimer's of those, some never did. Yeah, this is the ethical dilemma here, and we have not solved just by avoiding this, not telling the patient, but there is no solution at the moment, but I think this is a huge problem. So we have now invented technology which gives us more and more information, maybe some information people do not necessarily want to have, and now we have to deal with what we created. Yeah, so technological progress is not always for the good. Okay, to summarize that up for you, PET is not so available, only a few centers have it. It takes a huge amount of time until you get your data because the reconstructioning process is very complex. The resolution is relatively poor, but nevertheless, it gives you very good tissue contrast depending on the tracer you use, and you can get a lot of functional information like glucose metabolization. And in combining that with other scanning technologies, you can have both an anatomical and the physiological information. And it's also, as you saw from the complex infrastructure, quite a complex thing, an expensive thing to operate. So, that has been a very short journey through modern imaging technologies and where they come from. Do you have any questions? Not.
Oh.
Yep.
About the amyloid beta, because of the imaging, is the amyloid like the aggregation? Is it just stuck to the brain, or could it be flushed out?
Very good question. So how does it emerge, those plaques?
Yeah.
So beta amyloid is an element of a protein called APP, amyloid precursor protein, which we do not really know what it does, but it is involved in synaptic function. And you can cleave that protein in two different ways, getting two amyloid beta isoform. One is more healthy, the other is less healthy. Both occur in the normal brain, but the less healthy one, the pathological form, a much smaller amount. If that pathological form gets outside of the cell, it forms these aggregates, these plaques. How to explain it the best way? Because you're perfectly right with flushing out. So we do know how these plaques form, but we do not exactly know why. It could be two ways. It could be that we either have that cleavage going wrong because the APP needs continuous turnover, so you get more and more amount of the pathological amyloid beta. Or it may be, and maybe even a combination of those, that the amyloid is not properly removed. You have heard of the lymphatic system? Yeah? This is what transports away the beta amyloid. So if that does not really work, so a garbage collection problem, if you like, then you have a higher chance that these pathological isoforms have time to form a plaque, which cannot be removed then. And the lymphatic system works best when the blood pressure is low. So because it's working on a pressure-dependent gradient. So therefore the quality of sleep is very important to protect you from Alzheimer's. That speaks for the hypothesis that indeed it may be that the flushing out does not work well. Yeah? Or both, more pathological cleavage and inappropriate flushing out by the lymphatic system. For instance, if you have an improper sleep quality. Does that make sense?
Is it possible to inject something into, because for the lymphatic system, just basically it's CSF that just flows through the thingy, right?
Yeah.
Is it possible to like inject some sort of like chemicals inside of CSF and make it to that just target the amyloid plaques and basically happen to?
Yeah. So you cannot break up those plaques, but people did exactly what you suggest, but with a slightly different approach. They created antibodies against amyloid beta, which are then targeting the structure and flagging it for the immune system. Since you have neuroinflammation, you have immune cells around nevertheless, which is a pathological situation, but they are around. And with targeting the amyloid beta, you can get phagocytes in place, macrophages, or you can even activate the microglia, and they can then remove the beta amyloid. There have been very recent clinical trials, and since we had for decades really no progress in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, those antibodies showed a little bit of efficacy. So it was a very weak effect, and it only works in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, when the symptoms are not too worse yet. It does not cure the disease, but it prolongs the time before the more severe cognitive dysfunctions appear. So you can buy time. The problem is, these antibodies are horribly expensive, costs about $90,000 a year to provide them to the patient, and they have very adverse side effect. So by flagging up or targeting the amyloid and activating the immune system, you can create brain edema, which causes additional brain damage and terrible headaches. So the good thing is that for the first time we could make some progress and find something which is a little bit efficient, but the risk-benefit profile is far from being well balanced. But nevertheless, that could be refined now with subsequent things and putting improvements on the procedure until we have something which works better and is safer. Yeah. All right. Any further questions? No. Then I think we can conclude. And I wish you a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you're fixing everything. You see, like this is automated space.
Yeah.
Why don't they just use the
Maybe
invitation? No, but you can't do invitation in doing subjects. So you can do it by drops. So you could block, you could block like you could block like
It's just like mis-splicing, right? I don't know what it is. That
yeah,
plus
right,
the
it's a
opposite.
protein, so you have to block this enzyme. So competition.
So maybe APP is still very important though. Maybe
Oh,
this,
APP is important on this like this
Yeah.
pathway.
yeah, but if you block it, you're not gonna get the healthy one.
No,
that you
you're
want.
blocking beta secretase, but you're not blocking alpha secretase.
And by the way, is it